We've got 8 attendees. 11 people entering the room now.
Andrew?
Is Emma?
Hello, everybody. Just welcome you to AMAR's seminar. Just waiting for everyone to log on. And 1 or 2, like Andrew, to log off. That will be fine. We've just been joined by Baroness Nicholson, which is great. Baroness, can I introduce you to Michael very quickly?
Hello.
Hello, Michael. This is Emma.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks to Ashley for sorting it out. But we're so grateful to you because we're working hard to try to use music in a different way to recover identity and self-confidence and capabilities and skills in refugee camps and long stay in IDP camps, internally displaced people. And so this is hugely exciting, and we need your weight to persuade the globe. We're aiming for the Director General of the UN.
It's my real pleasure to help in any way I can.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So just to say, we're going to start our seminar now. We've had a little bit of technical issue because we've not been able to allow Michael to show the presentation he has. So hopefully that might rectify itself as we go on. But actually, otherwise, Michael's been a great sport in prepared to talk without any visible notes to show us. Now, the reason we're here is, as Baroness Nicholson just mentioned, is because AMAR is really keen to ensure that music is on the work we've done in Iraq, in the camps in KRG, especially with the Yazidis. We're seeing a lot of benefits to mental health, to identity, to the restoration of people's mindsets and support amongst people that are very much in need. So what we have today is a wonderful Professor Michael Spitzer, who you may have heard on Radio 4 very recently when he had Book of the Week. This is his book, The Musical Human, which I can attest is absolutely fantastic. It's a lovely mixture of anthropology, physiognomy, culture, music, everything you could ever imagine that brings music absolutely fundamental to the heart of humanity and how we all evolved. So Michael's got an enormous story to tell, a million years of music, but actually I think he's probably going to focus in on 1 or 2 parts today. Michael is Professor of Music at Liverpool University. He was previous at Durham University. And in Liverpool, he actually lives in Penny Lane, which I think we all know from a famous Beatles song. So I think music pervades him as much as anything else. So without me blathering on even further, I'd very much like to thank Michael and hand the floor to him. Just also to say, please put questions in the chat box. So if you have any particular thoughts you have or things that he's brought to your mind, we'll curate some questions and you can put them in the box and feel free to ask him. So without more ado, I'm handing over to Professor Michael Spitzer. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Ashley, for your very kind introduction. I'm honoured to be part of this. Okay, why is music so fundamental to humanity? There's a very simple and we know that because of the animals. And we make music for similar reasons as animals, essentially to bond with each other. So here's the paradox. Music is fundamentally human, but it's important because we're also animals. I'm often asked, what's the most interesting thing you discovered in writing the book? And I'll tell you 3 things which I've discovered in the course of today's talk. The first interesting thing is that whales were making music many millions of years before humans. And we now have the equipment to analyze humpback whale song, and we uncover the intricacy of what they do. And what they do is not that different from what jazz musicians do, which is to improvise on patterns, on templates, in very intricate and actually quite emotional ways. I was surprised how much I enjoyed whale song as a fellow mammal. I enjoyed the way that the notes, the pitches flowed into each other, a little bit like the medium, which is water, that whales inhabit. So in a similar or analogous way that humans are walking animals, and we hear footprints, footsteps in our music, we can hear swimming motions or, or liquidity in whale music. So Charles Darwin was actually quite cagey about are mammals, and we're a mammal, are mammals able to communicate with their voices? And I quote Darwin, and Darwin says, "It is a surprising fact that we lack good evidence that vocal organs are used by male mammals to charm the mammals compared certainly to birds." And music happened about 4 times in the Tree of Life. It happened with birds, it happened with cetaceans, whales and seals, it happened with bats, and it happened with humans. And the mammals stick out because apes don't have music. Apes are profoundly unmusical. They can't do what crickets can do, which is to play in time, looking at the pulse choruses of katydids and bush crickets. They can't do what birds can do, which is to learn new songs or create new melodies through vocal learning. And the cosmic joke is that sapiens evolved along the ape line, and apes were profoundly unmusical. So where did the musical human come from? The short answer is it came from gesture. But what apes are very good at doing is creating gesture. They are a visual species. And I think that the sociality of apes, the way they use gesture to bind their communities together, visually and tactilely, is the basis of all human music. So the take-home message really of the musical human in my book is that we are never alone, and music is never alone. Music is intrinsically a social practice. And in terms of human development, that starts with the games that caregivers or parents or typically perhaps mothers play with their babies. And that's called a proto-conversation or infant-directed speech or motherese. And you can see that the way with the baby or touches the child, and the way that's reciprocated in a game of surprise, attention getting, turn taking. This puts in place all the elements which blossom down the line in perhaps more sophisticated music. Certainly the dynamics of a jazz band is very similar to how mothers communicate with their children. And all of musical culture is there. Every culture on the planet does this, plays variations on this game. Every culture has music. Music is part of humanity. Another factor which distinguishes the West from perhaps the mainstream is that, generally speaking, these musical games are not written down. They're handed down orally from mother to child, from guru to disciple. It certainly happens in the West in folk music, in jazz, in trad music, but not in so-called classical music. And the story I tell in my book is that the tragedy begins 1,000 years ago when a monk called Guido d'Arezzo invents staff notation, and we get the habit of writing down our music, and that puts into place a habit of thinking of music as an object, a score, something written down, whereas really music is an activity like jogging or running or dancing. But we have in a habit of thinking of music as something that we mechanically reproduce or perform, whereas music itself is locked into the score. And that's a very alien way of thinking. And lots of quite profound repercussions I don't have time to go into today, but they constitute our story, our Western tradition. We are where we are, we can't undo that, and they are glorious fruits of that. Or India or parts of Africa have walked. A large part of my book is, you could say, decolonizing the Western curriculum, of thinking of the West as just a bit player of a much larger story of the planet's music. So what do I say in 20 minutes? Okay, the next thing I learned in my book is that those famous bone flutes discovered in the South German caves, in Hohlefels, for instance, 40,000 years ago, the Western story is said to begin, that human music is often said to begin with the discovery of these ancient instruments. Why in Germany? It's a white supremacist dream that the Germans invented music. It's purely circumstantial. There's an astonishing theory, it's actually a fact, that the flutes were made there because Africa lacked the right kinds of birds. It lacked birds with appropriately hollow bones, typically griffins, vultures, swans and cygnets. You need that kind of bird to make a hollow-boned instrument. And for strange reasons, they weren't around in Africa. So sapiens were certainly musical 100,000 years ago, or even further, in East Africa. But they lacked the opportunity to create instruments, and therefore to lay down the first fossils, the first relics of the history of music. Now, the third interesting fact is that the world's first recorded composer, that's to say, the name of a person who composed, was a woman and not a man. And her name was Enheduanna, and she was a daughter of King Sargon the Great of Sumeria, and she died in 2250. And she was a princess and a priestess who worshipped the moon god, and she sang songs on top of the ziggurat of Ur, which some people think was the original Tower of Babel. Why do I think she is significant? Well, firstly, she is a woman, and there is this thorny issue of sexism in Western music. There's a reason why practically all our canonic composers are not women, they're men. Of course, these are virulent cultural reasons. But the interesting thing is that these misogynistic Victorian musicologists appeal to scientists to validate their cultural prejudices. Darwin himself believed, and he was quite enlightened for his day, that whilst men compose, women only disposed. And if you look at ornithology, the theory used to be the case that only the male birds sang for sexual selection, and it was the women's job just to enjoy what the males sang. And this boiled down to, in the brain of the bird, something called area X, and I can't show to you in my non-existent slide, but area X is this putative region of the male bird's brain, which enables the male bird to sing, and this is why female birds can't sing. This is rubbish. And the last 10 years we've discovered it doesn't actually matter whether you have area X or not. There was a circularity that scientists in the field assumed that if a bird sang, it was necessarily a male bird. And because only males had area X, you see where this is going. So it takes the bottom out of the whole sexism of science and music, and then it feeds back into questioning why there are no female composers in Western music history. Let's park that on the back burner. We'll get back to this. And now turn the agenda to why, arguably, the home of music was the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Turkey, the Middle East. The first recorded housing development was a village called Catalhuyuk in Anatolia, or present-day Turkey, with a marvelous slide here, which you can't see, of a fresco discovered in one of the dwellings, and you can see people playing a violin. This is 9,000 years ago. Bows, and they were first developed really in the Fertile Crescent, and the rest is history. So I follow the lesson of the Silk Roads, Peter Frankopan's idea that the center of civilization is not Western Europe, it's actually Central Asia or the Middle East. And that's also the case for where music originates in this hemisphere. The first recorded musical score is called Hurrian Hymn Number 6, discovered in present-day Syria, and that's dated 1400 BC. So what is distinctive about music from this part of the world, as different from music in Western Europe? So if the West, or Western Europe at least, follows the path laid down by Guido d'Arezzo and staff notation, this obsession with pitch and counterpoint, the path walked by the Middle East, certainly in the Islamic world, I call that the path of ornament. And I got beautiful slides of the Alhambra Palace and the extraordinary walls. Ornament largely represent people or realistic humans. It also neglects counterpoint, that is all about line and ornament. But that is where the heart of Islamic music lies. And there's a famous report by Ahmed al-Tifachi, who was a philosopher from the Falsafa period. He died in 1253, and he noted that an Andalusian singer in Islamic Spain improvised for 2 hours on a single line of poetry. And another singer made 74 embellishments to a single phrase. So you can add this to the many inventions that we are grateful to Islam for, including algebra, the 3-course meal, underwear, words like magazine and gazette. Another invention is the idea of music expressing erotic yearning, and yearning for the unattainable beloved being a metaphor for the divine. And so therefore you can smuggle in essentially sex into music. And to speak very bluntly, I can't elaborate here, but the Christian church had one of the primary colour differences between Christian music and Islamic music was its lack of tolerance for the role of women in music. And now we can go back to the back burner and bring back Enedwana and the happy fact that the first recorded name of a composer was a female in the Fertile Crescent. And there was this extraordinary culture of slave girls creating music in early Islam. And there are noted Islamic women musicians, including Azza al-Maila, died 705, Jamila, died 720. And for a long time, music was even associated with female musicians. And that was a double-edged sword, because it was then therefore open for some caliphs to argue that music was thereby tainted by the association of females with concubines. So it's a very mixed blessing, a very double-edged sword. And this plays into the very ambivalence of Islam towards music in general. Now, we know that the Prophet didn't necessarily like music, but that said, the Quran doesn't at any place forbid music as haram. It was often how it was interpreted by later people. But that said, music has a very precarious position in Islamic culture. And certainly in early Islam, when music flourished, that was because of the pragmatism and the individual taste of the local caliphs. Another gift of Islam was, and this may be surprising to many people, that the connection of music and mental health starts off in the Middle East, although the doctors and medicine were Arabs. Early Arab doctors greatly valued the role of music in promoting mental health, and they borrowed that from the Greek notion of ethos. Ethos, or what became ethical in English, is the harmonious character of a person that music had a capacity to both capture and to regulate. If there's lack of harmony in the mind, the harmony of music can speak to that and regulate it. So Al-Kindi, another noted Arab philosopher, he said that music restores mental harmony. And downstream in 1488 in Turkey, Sultan Bayezid II in Edirne, he built a hospital, or in Turkish, Darussifa, which means a house of healing, and where water sound, the sound of fountains, and music therapy were regular prescriptions in the treatment of diseases, especially in the treatment of mental health. So, in conclusion, this segues neatly into the benefits of choral singing and the Yazidi choir of girl singers, which I think also neatly ties together the issue of the role of women in music, especially in the Middle East. So what are the benefits of music for mental health? You can dispose of the obvious ones, which are much noted. These are physical or chemical benefits. The release of endorphins, oxytocin, and dopamine. The physical benefit of breathing exercises, because of course singing is about breath control. And discipline and technique, that the technical aspect of singing well engages the sorts of discipline which can then be exported in all parts of life. And it teaches you social skills and team building, which again themselves can be exported elsewhere. Music is good at, is fantastic at expressing individual identity, who you are as a person, at the same time communicating and harbouring cultural heritage of where you came from and where you are today. So those are the well-known, the best-known benefits of music, but there are more subtle and profound ones. Music has always had this ability to capture the core of humanity, what it is to be human, which is the message of my book. And this core cannot be captured by language or by concepts. Music has always, a bit like religion, transcended words or reason. It's more powerful, more visceral than that. And music, as I said, is quintessentially social. It's about bonding, about bringing people together. And one of the most acute forms of unhappiness is alienation from people, or loneliness. Music makes you happy because music is about bonding. It brings people together. It can be as simple as that. That and the physical aspect of breathing or dancing makes you happy. So physically and socially, music makes you happy and then promotes good mental health. But I think the most profound benefit of music in this particular context of the Yazidi choir in the refugee camp and there we can look to what the birds can teach us. When a bird sings, the very song that the bird projects through air creates its territory. Territory is not something you can mark by drawing a line in the sand or creating a fence. Territory is literally an outpouring, an emanation from the spirit. It comes from within the mouth and it's very precarious. It lasts as long as the breath does. But to the same extent it's very precarious, it's a marker of resilience and defiance and a strength of will and strength of purpose, which makes it extremely personal and hard won. and very noble. So music creates a home in this most fundamental sense. I'll park it there. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. And just a small snapshot of the richness of what you've been writing about. Obviously, it's fundamental to the way we evolve as a social species. And I love the idea of music creates a home for you, a space in which culture or individual can dwell. I'm quite interested in the evolution of the Islamic music, which at the beginning of, say, the 8th century, you say was often sung by women or rung by women and was quite ornamental, possibly rhythmic. This lasted maybe for 300 or 400 years. And at the time, the Christians were a bit more austere about everything. Can you explain a bit more about that period and why did it prosper so much? And how did it come to change into becoming very much a male preserve, an area that got closed down and leadership?
Through the incursion of the Islamic culture into Spain and the circulation of the mushashasha, which is a kind of courtly song, Islamic music lit a fuse under Europeans, which became the Renaissance 200 years later, after 300 AD, by the troubadours in Spain picking up these mushasha and translating them from Arabic into French and Spanish, and then teaching Europe courtly song and the music of love. And we learned that from the Islamic world. And I think that was a very profound surprise for me, because we always assumed the Renaissance is the most important event in musical world history, and it starts about 14 or 1500. We learned that from the much earlier Islamic Renaissance around 1300, around Spain. So it's a politics between Christianity and Islam, and both rewrite each other's histories. So who do you read? It depends which side you read. Certainly around 1300 or before, Islam was much superior to Western civilization, particularly because it was the custodian of Greek wisdom. Plato and Aristotle and Euclid and music theory, the Greek musical modes became the makam of Arab music. And it was a melting pot, and it was much more, because of Islam, democratic than, in spirit, than the Christian ethos was. There's a it's much more about the brotherhood of, or the sodality, as it were, of the listeners, the audience, with the community of the musicians. It's less egocentric, and it's also much more secularized. It's already developing secular themes of love, whereas just across in Rome or in Spain, they're much more God orientated, and they have a great problem with expressing humanity, and that's ironic given that we think that Islamic culture doesn't represent reality very well. It's the other way around, I think. So the other thing to do with why did they recruit female slaves as musicians, the word slave isn't quite right, because just as Islam, and I'm no authority at all, as Islam very quickly spread like a bushfire throughout the whole North African region, then through Europe, it had to systematically recruit all the local populations. So these so-called slaves were actually ex-slaves. They converted and became assimilated, albeit they were often courtesans. But if you're an aristocratic musician, then you were allowed to participate in the salon with men. He was bisexual. There wasn't this proscription of women only singing to women, that they tolerated what we will call salons much later in history, where men would enjoy the performances of women. And that was so forward-looking.
If I may just ask one more question before we have a few questions from the audience as well, but just from my own perspective, I'm really thinking about the oral traditions of music and the cultures that still retain that, and probably retain music as a central part of their being and the way they are. The Yazidis to an extent are, because they look at music as the way they look at the agricultural year or their religious year. Actually looking at flamenco music in Spain is probably an interesting echo of Arabic music in Spain. But you talk in the book about what they're about. Could you perhaps articulate one or two of those?
Well, I talk about China, the Chinese path, and India, and both in China and India, there's a tradition of handing down music through the oral tradition of a teacher teaching their student how to sing or to play a piece, and tolerating them to be creatively adventurous in how to interpret it. But to all intents, it's the same tradition, and that's handed down through many, many generations. So creativity isn't composing, it's not performing, it's somewhere in the middle, and which is why they stress improvisation and decoration much more than we do. We certainly have that in jazz, and when we play a Bach concerto, we can add ornaments to it, but those are seen as peripheral to the music in itself or the structure. And we have a very small margin of interpretation where we allow a performer to mess around with the intention of the genius composer, the authority of the composer. And that's really lacking in most parts of the world.
We have a question here from Bishop. Control and conformity rather than simply creativity.
Well, Bishop, I'm afraid it's the church. That Guido was a monk, and at least in the 11th century begins as an instrument of Carolingian control across the empire. So I call it in the book, with a song to bind them. So you make sure that everybody, every outpost of Christendom, as far away as Northumbria, where I used to live, you can guarantee that without needing to send soldiers or clerks, you will guarantee that people on Hadrian's Wall will sing the same hymns from the same hymn tune as people in Rome. It's a way of guaranteeing control. And that received a twist with colonialism and the, shall we say, the conspiracy between the church and empire building. So when, I forget his name, not Pizarro, the Aztecs, 1519. Somebody help me out.
There was Pizarro went there, right?
When the Spanish invade Mexico, and the first thing they do is kill all the musicians, you kill the cheerleaders. They import Spanish polyphony, and within 10 years you have Indian singers singing Spanish music in Mexico Cathedral. So by 1528 you have Aztec musicians reading Spanish scores, and then 100 years later in 1618 you have the birth of the first great Aztec years as Victoria, or a Renaissance Spanish composer, and these became canonical masterpieces. So you have this, treaty, this agreement between the colonial invaders and the church and music, and on the back of these ships, music with scores takes over the world. But it has to be a score, because with a score, it's like a message in a bottle. You send it away and it finds itself thousands of miles away, and it can be read quite literally. It's the power of music notation, and that's a literate culture, analogous to how the English language or Shakespeare or cricket or technology or capitalism, all these Western forces also take over the world. And notation is just another facet of this much more general process of globalization.
A bit like a sort of musical spreadsheet that goes around the corporates today, and people fill in the bits and keep the same everywhere.
His name was Cortes, of course, not Pizarro.
Cortes, oh yes, yeah. Another question here is, let me have a look. Yes, from Indy. Are particular frequencies of pure tones, sine waves, either harmful or beneficial? Is there a beneficial wave or a damaging one?
Well, there is actually. It's not a crank. It's a very interesting new development. It's E-natural. And why E-natural? Because that's the resonance that the neurons in the brain make connections to each other with. Or even incipient Alzheimer's, when they sit in this chair half an hour a day, after a couple of years, it freezes Alzheimer's in its tracks, because the resonance of E-natural somehow engages with the wavelength of neurons in the brain. It's a very exciting new development.
Wow. Is that which E? Is it a particular?
Yeah, it's a particular
CE, or is it a top
I
E?
think it's Hertz 40.
Okay, that could catch on rather rapidly, couldn't it? Are there any other notes we need to know about? I mean, maybe playing songs started in with an E-natural, and that's why it works so well. The resonances. Right, we have one from Andrew Methvin, I think, wants to ask a question. Andrew, do you have one? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
First point is 40 hertz is very, very low indeed. That must be sort of 3 octaves below C. Anyway, no, my question was, how does music in Australasia, so the Aborigines, and also in North America, the North American Indians, who obviously were separated until relatively recently on their own evolutionary paths, how does that fit in with your schema? Thank you.
Well, we know because of Bruce Chatwin popularised this idea of song lines, where the indigenous peoples of Australia, as they travel through the desert, they peg songs around aspects of the natural landscape, mountains and ravines and tracks. It's a way of mapping the landscape. And we can deduce that as sapiens spread out of Africa, it reached Australia long before it reached to follow the journey of sapiens through music. But as they journey from across the circumpolar regions in Northern Europe and Japan and Siberia to Alaska and Canada, you can track the diffusion of musical genes or memes, you could say, that these are musical practices which are carried by generations. And you can see similarities between, say, the Chukchuk of Siberia with the Inuit of North America. Throat singing, for instance, is practiced in both parts of the world. But I say in my book that one of the interesting changes is that in Siberia, you dance and you sing at the same time. Right? So you have a single genre which describes throat singing with dancing. If you compare that with the Inuit, they have two different genres. They separate out the dance from the song. And that's very typical to what happens when music diffuses. What starts off as the same or similar diverges. It's very speculative, and it's an example of inferential thinking, which you have to use if you're going that far back in time. There's no evidence. You have to look to what's happening today and extrapolate back or reverse engineer.
There are elements today, the echoes of the past, aren't there? Still remaining, probably in the Amazon, in the Congo, You know, maybe the Yazidis to an extent are echoes of something that happened 1,000 years ago, Zoroastrian perhaps, and, you know, to ward off evil spirits and the flutes, all those kind of things, or the kawals. So it's quite possible that those are echoes of old cultures.
Yeah.
I think Baroness Nicholson has a question. Emma, would you like to ask a question?
What has been fascinating to discover is that music seems to be inherent in the deepest part of the brain, since you can have patients, young people, children, whose response to music is absolutely obvious, where they cannot function in any other way. And the response from the music therapist, which I'd love your comment on, is that this must mean that music is buried so deep in the cerebral cortex that it doesn't get harmed either in the womb if there's an injury or at birth with an injury. What is your thinking about that?
I think just as music comes before language, it also comes at the end of language, when we're at the end of our life, and if we have dementia or Alzheimer's, and we lose the capacity to communicate, we can still not just enjoy music, but when we hear it, it reanimates that core of our identity. And there are famous examples of people who've had catastrophic brain deficits or injury, but when they're listening to music, or perhaps when they're conducting it, they regain a sense of who they are, including their control of memory and knowledge and skills. But that's switched off as soon as the music is switched off. It's quite remarkable. This ability of music to tap into our deeper selves, our identity. So experts like Adam Ockleford, who's probably the foremost authority on music and autism in the UK, if not the world, he has many studies. But when they're with Adam, and he's both their piano teacher and their friend, and he helps them, they have a social relationship with him, which includes humour, teasing, knowledge, vast knowledge of lots and lots of music, and music is a medium where this can happen.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just wonder if there are any other questions lurking. I think that may be it for the moment. But I've got a question, Michael. Your book, The Musical Human, which I recommend to everybody to read. Where's the best place to get it?
Well, oh gosh, I would like to say Waterstones, but unfortunately, when I popped into the local branch here, I found it next to a Jimi Hendrix book, which is great, but it was quite niche. I like to think of the book as being a broader appeal than just a music book, you know. So if you want to, I'm very loath to recommend the A word. You know what I mean? Amazon, you know. But it's very, very quick. But if you want to get it from the W.H. Smith shop or Foyles or the other outlets, I don't know. Is it difficult to get?
I got mine straight off Bloomsbury, I think, at a nice discount as well. Great present for somebody, I'd say.
Excellent.
And have you got some? You've got quite a few interests from the media at the moment. You've got quite a lot of things coming up. Should we? Aspects of this.
Well, I'm talking to there's a couple of television options, but the next things are The Big Think, which is an American podcast for public intellectuals, which could be quite interesting. But I do see the book as, this may sound funny, but almost for non-musicians. It's for everybody, not just for musicians. Does that sound a bit funny to say that? I don't know, but if you don't think you're a musician, but you really are, because we're all musicians, really, That's what I mean by that.
Everybody can sing in their own way, I think it's fair to say. I think, if you don't mind, there's one other question just popped in here. It says from Gillian Dare, music predates speech. I think both music, vocal and instrumental, originated before speech. In India and some other cultures, non-word singing is still core. How does this relate to ancient concepts and more civilizations of the music of the spheres, which holds together the universe and a part of all animate beings?
Yeah, great. Part of chapter 11 actually updates the music of the spheres, which deals with harmony in the cosmic sense of proportions. I look at it in terms of repetition or self-similarity of chaos theory and fractals. Mm-hmm. How the shape of the Orion galaxy has the same shape as a human cell, for instance. And music is the art of repetition. So music is fractal. So in the course of music being self-replicating at rising levels, it's echoing how the universe works.
I think that's a great way to end. Is there anything you'd like to say at all before?
AMAR all the best, isn't it? To be part of it in a very small way. So thank you for inviting me.
Michael, I can't thank you enough. It's been fantastic. And for all those that maybe didn't see it or would like to watch it again, we will be posting this either on the AMAR YouTube channel, and hopefully we might even have some of your slides we could possibly include. And big apologies we couldn't show the pictures, but I think they're going to have to buy the book to get that. But thank you so much, and we'll keep you in touch as to how things evolve. And just generally, we will probably be having another talk next month with a slightly different angle, most likely with Michael Bachman. So let's see what emerges. Thank you so much, Michael, and enjoy the book, everybody. Thanks, Faye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.